Carol Bell, I'm the treasurer, but don't worry, I'm not going to ask you directly for money, but welcome. And I'd just like to say a few words for those who aren't familiar with the society, about our background. This organisation was founded in 1707 at a meeting in the pub, the Bear Tavern, for the purpose of investigating and debating material remains of the past found in Britain. Today, we remain focused on the same objectives, and as a registered charity, we are committed to sharing our collections and our work with the public, which we do through public lectures such as this one, public tours, exhibitions, and there's an interesting one coming up shortly, about which you can learn in the foyer, and through disseminating scholarly research through seminars such as this one and publications. Last year, we also launched an affiliate membership scheme. So if you like what you see here, there's no need to become a fellow necessarily, but you can join us as an affiliate and be a part of our wider family. So turning to today's lecture, it's my great pleasure for the second time to introduce Professor Aidan Dodson. Last time he addressed us on Duke Alexander and his sarcophagi, which was a fascinating lecture about a Scottish duke and his collections. But today the title is The Nubian Pharaohs of Egypt. Professor Dodson is Honorary Professor of Egyptology at the University of Bristol and was elected a Fellow of the Society in 2003. He studied in Durham, Liverpool, and Cambridge universities and was Simpson Professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo for the spring of 2013 and Chairman of the Egypt Exploration Society from 2011 to 2016. He's the author of some 30 books, both on Egyptology and modern naval history, and his book on the Nubian Pharaohs of Egypt, the subject of today's talk, was published by the American University in Cairo Press at the end of last year. So I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that. Professor Dodson has agreed to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, leaving 15 minutes for questions afterwards. Thank you very much. I'm just handing over to Aidan, and welcome back to the Society of Antiquaries.
Thank you very much indeed. Nice to be back here again. And yes, today I'm going to be talking about the Nubians who took over and ruled Egypt for about a century. This is very much an about turn for the usual dynamics of these things. Nubia had spent much of its existence as an outpost, a colony of Egypt, but then for a short period of time, the tables were turned. Now, the area which we're talking about where these kings come from, and this is, I'm very much emphasizing, we're talking about their rule in Egypt, although we need to look a little bit about what happened to them beforehand, is this area here, which spans the borders of the modern states of Egypt and Sudan, and is divided between Lower Nubia and Upper Nubia, roughly divided on the modern political boundary. Now, to say, for much of its ancient existence, Nubia was under some kind of domination of Egypt, either directly or indirectly through trade, one-off exploitation, and so on. But from about 1500 BC, Nubia becomes a formal viceroyalty of Egypt, and we have here a depiction from the wall of a tomb of one of the viceroys appointed to rule Nubia under the Egyptians, a man called Hui, who held office during the reign of Tutankhamun. And here he is receiving all the various goodies, which are one of the main reasons why Egypt wanted Nubia. Human resources, including slaves at the top there, but also lots of other kinds of resources, both from Nubia itself and also traded further south in Africa. And probably at the top of the list was gold. The Nubian gold mines were effectively what bankrolled Egypt during its new kingdom from about 1500 BC down to about 1100 BC. And there are begging letters in the records from the kings of Babylon, for example, saying, send gold, lots of gold, because I've heard that gold is as dust in the land of Pharaoh. But a lot of that dust actually came from Nubia. And the role of Nubian viceroy continues to be an important part of the Egyptian state until we get to the very end of the Egyptian New Kingdom at the beginning of the 11th century BC. And there, at that point, Egypt itself is starting to fall apart. The Bronze Age collapse, although the various people movements which accompanied it hadn't directly taken over Egypt, the world was a different place. And in the early 11th century, Egypt's control of Nubia, and indeed its control of its own internal unity, falls apart. And here we've got rather an emblem of the whole situation, where on the left is the high priest of Amun and also viceroy of Nubia at that point, Herihor, and on the right is King Ramesses XI, the last king of the Egyptian New Kingdom. And you see this shown on exactly the same scale, which a couple of decades earlier would have been completely unheard of. But now that is very emblematic of the way that the pharaonic state is now starting to collapse. And indeed, that collapse ultimately is only rescued for a while by the Nubians, but that's further on in our story. Now, effectively, it means that by the middle of the 11th century BC, Nubia is on its own again. There's that the last traces of Egyptian control have disappeared. And we're now into what has been dubbed the Nubian Dark Ages. Not necessarily because things were particularly dark for the Nubians themselves, we don't really know what's going on very well during this period. And there are only a few odd glimpses of things which might suggest what's going on during the period from the collapse of Egyptian domination through to the next time we see Nubia as a political entity in the 8th century BC. And one of the places where we find potential evidence of what's going on here is at this location, Kawa. Kawa is a very sandy place, and this is the current view of temples A and B there. Now, the thing is, these are not the last remains of the foundations of destroyed temples. They're the tops of the walls of a very well-preserved temple. It's been excavated a couple of times, but is now completely swallowed up in the sand. The temple A was originally built under Tutankhamun. Temple B was built by a king called Iri. That seems the best way of reading his name. And amongst the things which are there is this stela. It's the lunette of it now in the Carlsberg Glyptothek in Copenhagen. And this belongs, say, to a king called Iri. Now, a lot of the conventional histories of Nubia place him much, much later in Nubian history. But somebody who actually is in the audience today suggested most persuasively a few years ago that actually he makes far more sense in this Nubian Dark Age period, because his titulary is effectively copied from a new king's titulary. And although the Egyptian on the stele is a bit ropey, it doesn't necessarily imply that it's massively later, merely that immediate contact with Egypt and the scribal schools of Egypt have now been lost. So placing him somewhere in this period directly following the Egyptian withdrawal seems to make quite a lot of sense. Also probably to be placed in this same period is something up here at Semna, on the border now of modern Egypt and Sudan, effectively also the meeting place of Lower and Upper Nubia, where we have a huge or had, it's now long since dissolved on the bed of Lake Nasser, the lake created by the building of the Aswan High Dam. A massive brick fortress built in the Middle Kingdom, but then rebuilt in the New Kingdom. And it had a nice little temple, a New Kingdom temple, which was salvaged and is now in the garden of the Sudan National Museum in Khartoum. But here is the temple while it was still in situ. And on the opposite side of the temple from what we're looking at here, there is this tableau of a queen called Katimala. She uses standard Egyptian queenly titles. Like the Iri Stela, the text is in Egyptian, but not particularly brilliant Egyptian. Interestingly, she doesn't actually say who her husband is. But the text, the best parallels to its grammar seems to be from sort of the probably the 10th century or so BC. And therefore, she probably is also somebody in this. And the text talks about a struggle with a local tribe. So and there's also a couple of other items which have this kind of feel to them, which probably belong somewhere during this period between the Egyptian departure and Nubia appearing properly in the record once again. The chronology of them is, say, very, very up in the air, up into somewhere in a period of a couple of centuries. From part of that period, we also seem to have some remains which we can't tie into these couple of post-Egyptian kings. At El Kuru here, which would become the first royal cemetery of the revived kingdom of Kush, which is the ancient name for Nubia, and which is the term under which it effectively ruled Egypt. But El Kuru here, this is the site as it is today. The pyramid on the right there, you can ignore, that's much, much later. But over onto the left, there's a whole series of earlier tombs which go back to somewhere during or even slightly before the departure of the Egyptians. In particular, we're talking about these tumulus tombs here, some of which contained material which is recalls or is datable to the late New Kingdom. The big problem with this cemetery, which certainly ends up with tombs dating to the time of the Nubian domination of Egypt, is whether or not it actually is a continuum or not, or whether or not there are gaps in the sequence. And that's one of the big archaeological debates surrounding this period in Nubia is Kuru a single sequence, or is there a gap? Particularly, is there a gap following the early tumulus tombs before we then pick up again a sequence which we can reasonably assume runs through to the point where the Nubians are ruling Egypt. Now, while Nubia seems to be getting itself together, although the level of detail of that is difficult to achieve, Egypt is rather going in the opposite direction quite significantly. From about the middle of the 9th century, the country starts falling apart. It's had some fallings apart earlier on, but this seems to be a particularly significant one because Thebes, the southern part of Egypt, becomes detached from the rest of Egypt. And also elsewhere in Egypt, we start getting various local dynasties springing up. But Thebes certainly detaches early in the middle of the 9th century and will not really become properly reattached until somewhere in the middle of the 7th century. So it's it's a couple of hundred years really of Thebes doing its own thing to some degree. They have a civil war, which is the reason why we've got these couple of overlapping. Let me just get the laser pointer on. Because with this reason why we've got these parallel kings up here. They finally get out of their civil war and we get a couple of kings, Okay. Oh dear. I know, yes. Yes. Oh, God. Problem as well.
Yeah. For everybody online, we're just making our way back into the room after a fire alarm, and we'll resume shortly. Oh.
It happened because of a reasonable point, as you'll see in the story. So if I've got to break the story, here was a reasonably good place to start the next bit.
Oh, and HSE wise, that's okay, is it? Good. You can see that I come from the oil and gas business, where fire alarms are sort of something that you take very, very seriously. But please accept our apologies for that unforeseen interruption. We'll now resume. Obviously, if you have to leave, Professor Dodson will not be insulted if you have to get up and leave before he finishes. But he reliably informs me that where we were interrupted was not a bad place to be interrupted. So go ahead.
Okay. Yes, where were we before we got so rudely interrupted? Let me just pop back just to here. To say where we are, we're in the middle of the 9th century, and it's all started going horribly wrong. Towards the end of the beginning of the 8th century, Thebes gets its act together under kings Zorkon III and Takelot III, Zorkon III and Takelot III. This shows Zorkon on the right and Takelot while still crown prince on the left. But after the reign of Takelot, we find a complete change in the situation in Thebes. Exactly how this came to happen, we have absolutely no idea. This is always the problem with writing ancient Egyptian history. There's lots of suddenly, if something's happened, but why? Don't know, is the answer. And what this is the appearance on the Egyptian border of a king called Kashta. And this is a fragment of stela from Aswan, which is the southernmost city of Egypt proper. Beyond that, we're in Nubia, and so we have this stela of this king Kashta. And then at the same time in Thebes, at Karnak, the center, the main religious center, south of Egypt, we find in the Karnak priestly annals, which are a set of texts going back a number of centuries from this point and forward as well. It's recording day-to-day inductions. We suddenly find an induction dated the year 1 of this Nubian king, Kashta. That seems to be the only fundamental change, is that we move from having the previous line of Theban kings, represented by Takelot III, being replaced by Kashta. Everybody else seems to be the same as they had previously. And also, it's worth bearing in mind, up in the north, there is another dynasty chugging along, ruling in the north of Egypt, as a result of this whole disintegrations, previous generations. Kashta only is around for a short period of time. We don't know exactly how long. Year 1 is the only one we've got. And the suggestion has been made that he might have ended his life nastily. This stela, which has been a matter of a lot of discussion over the years, so-called excommunication stela, probably is to be dated to the reign of his successor, a king known either as Pa or Pianki. It's the same person. It's just we're not sure whether how to read one sign of his name. I'll try and call him Pa. If I call him Pianki, I apologize. But it has been suggested this stela, which talks about something horrible happening and sort of some very nasty punishments to some priests responsible, it has been suggested that something might have been the murder of Kashta. But again, this is just simply reading something into a rather obscure text, but it would explain why Kashta sort of suddenly disappears. And we now have a king Pa on the Nubian throne and also in control of Thebes. So what seems to have happened at the Kashta is that Nubia is a single entity and that the area of Thebes, the southern part of Egypt, has been absorbed into that. So presumably by some kind of peaceful means, given there is no massive changeover of personnel, but that's really sort of an argument from silence. Now, at this point, as I said, that Egypt has been sort of slowly falling apart over the previous generations. This seems to be roughly what Egypt looks like at this point in the late 8th century. These borders are not exact, they're just simply representative of giving an idea of where these polities seem to sit, with Nubia now linked in with the southern part of Egypt. So again, that's where I've put the border is fairly nominal. It's just simply to give an idea. Now, as far as relationships between this new Nubio-Theban entity is concerned and the others, the king based at Heracleopolis around the Fayum seems to be a formal ally of some description. And we know that from a text of Pa, which then says that the Heracleopolitans are attacked from the north by the Princedom of the West, the top northwestern part of Egypt. And he is joined by various others in trying to get rid of, or take over Heracleopolis. And as a response to this, Pa then sends forces northwards to relieve the Heracleopolitans, and then he goes himself, and ultimately he manages to squash the various entities who'd been originally kicking off against Heracleopolis. That is the short version. There is a much, much longer version, and that longer version is actually told on this great stela now in Cairo. It's actually from Jebel Barkal in Sudan, which gives PA's account of this whole campaign. And quite usefully, it gives us a snapshot of who is ruling where in Egypt at that time, and that map is partly derived from that. And of the various people who are ruling bits of Egypt, no fewer than 5 of them at this stage are all calling themselves pharaoh, including Pa himself. So it does rather show how the former unitary state of Egypt has now well and truly fallen apart. The only one who isn't yet a king is Tefnachti, the prince of the west. It's Sais there in the northwest of Egypt. And he's the one who seems to have kicked off the whole thing. So it looks as though ultimately what's going on at this stage is ultimately a struggle between the Saites, the city of Sais in the northwest, and the Nubians for control of Egypt. And ultimately, the Saites will win, but not for well over another century. And at the end of the whole thing, PA takes a submission of the various people, and on the top left-hand corner of the stela are shown the 4 kings who are submitting to him. So here they all are, which were on the previous diagram. The splodged, which is where Pa is where he's been erased and then reinstated. Somebody took against Pa at some point, then somebody then came back in his favor again. So most of his representations have all suffered that way. The only person who doesn't submit, there's also various local mayors, chieftains, and others all submit in person to PA. The exception is Tefnachti, who basically sends a letter and says, okay, sorry, I give up, I'll promise to be good. which isn't actually the case, as we all see. Which isn't actually the case, because not long after PA leaves, because he doesn't take over Egypt as a single pharaoh, he simply takes the loyalty of these various local rulers and then heads off back to the south again. Tefnachti then becomes pharaoh and adds himself to the roster of local kings. After this campaign, PA seems to reign for another couple of decades. And is ultimately buried at El Kuru in the first tomb here, which we can definitely attribute on the basis of items. It's very small. It was originally a small pyramid with a rock cut, with a trench cut burial chamber, but all that's left today is are the walls of the lining of the burial chamber. They're in a roof over that, and a little pyramid would have been built over the top of that, because the Nubian kings adopt pyramids as their burial monuments, possibly not necessarily copying the kings of the remote past in Egypt, as has sometimes been argued, but possibly just simply the fact that these resemble small pyramids that have been built locally in Nubia during the New Kingdom. Once kings gave up on pyramids, ordinary people picked up on them as well. On PA's death, however, things do rather change. He seems to be perfectly happy to have had a hands-off role as far as Egypt was concerned. His successor, Shabbataka, takes a rather different view on things. And rather than just simply rule Egypt from a distance, he actually moves up into Egypt and actually takes control. Although the only one of the various local kings who he displaces is Tefnachti's successor in Sais. All the other ones are left in place. But now the Nubian king becomes the dominant figure in Egypt. And these are the couple of remains of that last Saite king, who later tradition says was burnt alive by the Nubian king. Whether that's true or not, but again, it does, the fact that this is the one local king who is displaced does fit in with this idea that behind everything which is going on during this period is ultimately a struggle between the northwest and the far south for control of the middle. The new sort of concept of the Nubian kings vis-a-vis Egypt is probably summed up neatly in the fact that they have double uraei on their brows. The uraeus, the cobra, had been the standard thing on the front of an Egyptian king's crown going back to the earliest days. But a double uraeus was unheard of as far as kings were concerned. And it's generally been argued that the two cobras, one represents Nubia and one represents Egypt. So what he's become is a king of both of these domains, which is sometimes always been called Egypt Kush. And it's also interesting that where later on, when later Egyptians took the view that the Nubians were probably not such a good thing after all, when their representations were usurped, one of the kings which was done was the removal of one of the uraei, taking it back down to a single uraeus. Although a few examples do survive. So we've got a nice example there on the right of the two in situ. PA seems to have done virtually nothing as far as building work in Egypt, which is to say he seems to have regarded himself as fundamentally a Nubian pharaoh who happens just to have Thebes as part of his domain. Shabbataka and his successors take a rather different view. Here at Karnak, here, a small temple of Osiris Hekajet, which had been built by Zorkon III, and Takelot III is enlarged, and the representation of Shabbataka, which I showed previously, is on the facade of that. Also, he builds a small chapel in the southeastern part of the enclosure, and this chapel. Most of the wall blocks are now in Berlin, but also he builds elsewhere, which we can tell from blocks found at various locations. For example, these are from Edfu, showing that there is some kind of construction work. So Shabbataka is taking much more of an interest in Egypt. Also, he takes on responsibility for external affairs. Up until this point, such information as we have on Egyptian foreign relations during this period seems to suggest that the kings in Tanis, in the northeast of Egypt, even when Tanis was no longer a national dynasty, were ones who were dealing with foreign stuff, including relationships with the Assyrians. But then we find this inscription here, this Assyrian inscription found in Iran, which indicates that Shabbataka is now somebody who they're dealing with. In this case, it's when he extradites a fugitive from Syria who'd fled to Egypt and hands him over to the Assyrians. What's interesting is that the text rather sort of said that the existence of a place called Nubia is a bit, or at least Kush anyway, is a bit of a surprise to the Assyrians. They're new players on the ancient world stage. And this inscription is quite useful in the sense that, as we have a much better chronology for the Assyrians than we do the Egyptians, we can actually place these kings quite well. Although there are some who would question this because this bit of Egyptian chronology, Egyptian and Nubian, has been thrown up in the air in recent years by the discovery of this inscription. But given fire alarm, I will simply pass over there, and you can read up on it later on. Shabbataka, not long after this extradition, dies and is buried at El Kuru again, which remains the principal burial place. And here we can just see a nice little the evolution of the royal tombs at El Kuru, from sort of the small cut and cover of PA, a slightly larger cut and cover of Shabbataka, and then the next reign and Shabaka, we have a fully rock-cut burial chamber here. The Shabaka, the next king, again seems to take a slightly different approach to international affairs. From what little information we have, and certainly the very fact that Shabbataka extradited this Assyrian fugitive to Assyria, suggests an appeasement approach to the Assyrians. Shabaka seems to take a rather more active one. It's during his reign that one places the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem, and it has been suggested that it's the presence of the Egypto-Nubian army, which is one of the reasons why the Assyrians don't actually take Jerusalem on that occasion. And also we have other hints, because at Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrians, we've found a couple of seal impressions of Shabaka. Quite what those are related to. Some have rather romantically tried to recall them seals for a peace treaty. They're interesting in the sense that there's not just the Shabaka's impression, there's also an Assyrian one on the same chunk of mud. So we're not really quite sure what's going on here. But certainly the very presence of these at Nineveh, a counter-stamped seal impression, does suggest there is something going on between Shabaka and and the Assyrians. And it's also interesting, it's not for a couple of 20 years that Assyria seems to worry itself with Egypt again. So something interesting is going on. So often with these things, one is frustrated by the fact something's happening, but not quite sure what it all means. Back at home, one of the things we do find under Shabaka, and in fact under the kings of this period in general, is a harking back to the remote past. I think probably as a result of disintegrations which had happened in Egypt over the previous decades and centuries, There's a desire perhaps to go back to the good old days. And this inscription, the Shabaka stone in the British Museum, later reused as a grinding surface, unfortunately, purports to be a copy of an ancient papyrus which had been found. So it's a theological text, and whether it is really an ancient text or something mocked up to seem ancient remains a matter of debate. But it's harking back to the past. Also, we look in the royal titularies of this period. They're they're greatly simplified. They recall the Old and Middle Kingdom titularies. So there does seem to be an attempt to look back to the past here. At Karnak, we find constructions dating to the time of Shabaka. And in fact, by this time, his son, Horimachet, is high priest of Amun there. And Amenerdis, who's actually the first, who's actually a daughter of Kashta, and had been installed right at the beginning of the Nubian domination of the south, is there as God's wife. So these are effectively the two heads of the Amun cult. And they are doubtless the ones who managed the building work carried out under Shabaka at Karnak. For example, here at the Temple of Ptah, where a new gateway was added. Also, under Shabaka, a new gateway is added within the main pylon here at the Temple of Luxor. And across the river, also still at Thebes, at Medinet Habu, he adds a new pylon to the front of the Temple of Amun there. And what's interesting here is this seems to be a policy of the Shabaka and also his successor, Taharqa, is to do your building work at the front of the entrances to structures so you get your maximum bang for your buck. That you've put, this new gateway, everybody's got to go through it. Therefore, you're putting your stamp on the building, probably for lesser expenditure than other things might be. He is buried again at El Kuru. This is the entrance to his tomb. So it's the first fully rock-cut example here. And also there are traces of decoration on the walls. Unfortunately, too badly damaged to be able to make out exactly what's going on, but they seem to be the typical kind of funerary texts which have previously been used by the pharaohs of Thebes and Tarnis going back into the New Kingdom. And we'll just see an example at the end of an intact example of this kind of thing. The last Nubian to actually rule Egypt properly is Taharqa, Shabaka's successor. And unlike Shabaka and Shabatarka, who seem to have put all their resources into building in Egypt rather than in their home territory, we do have building work by Taharqa here at Jebel Barkal, the holy mountain, which was the religious center of Upper Nubia going back into probably at least 1500 BC, and was carried on by the Kushites. And here, underneath this pinnacle, which a natural pinnacle of rock, which was perceived by the ancients as being a rearing cobra, and in fact under Taharqa had some additional bits of carving and gilded additions to make it look even more so. At the bottom of that pinnacle, he builds a rock-cut temple, now known rather prosaically as B300, with a built exterior and then a rock-cut interior view of that there. He also builds at Kawa. Again, this is not the foundations of a destroyed temple. These are the upper parts of the walls of a completely buried temple. It was excavated by an Oxford expedition between the wars. And as a result, we have one of the rams from here is on display in the British Museum. Another one is in the Ashmolean in Oxford. And also, there's this rather fine little chapel of Taharqa from this temple, which are on display there. Some quite interesting information about Taharqa's reign comes from here at Karnak. This is the podium or quay side. And this was used at this period to mark the highest levels reached by the annual Nile flood. And the highest of them all is this one here of year 6 of Taharqa. Now, particularly high floods were normally a bad thing, and we have various examples of that. For some reason, this particular year's one was okay. And we have a number of inscriptions left by Taharqa proclaiming how good it was. It killed snakes, it did all sorts of things. So an interesting little, and the very fact he writes about this in more than one text does indicate that it's regarded as being quite unusual to have a really good result from a very high flood rather than a non-problematic one. Like Shabaka, he followed the approach of maximum bang for buck when looking at his building. So his fundamental work at Karnak is all adding colonnades to the entrances to the 4 cardinal points going into the temple complex. The most impressive being the one here. And here we are looking down onto it. And this vast kiosk, these colossal columns, was the work of Taharqa. So again, so he could actually get maximum recognition, probably for lesser expenditure than in the case of he'd built a whole pile or something like that. So interesting sort of example of how these things are being done. A lot of the work was actually probably carried out under the direction of this gentleman, who is Monchuimhat, who was the mayor of Thebes. He was also the 4th priest of Ammon, so he's number 4 in the religious hierarchy. And he's one of the great survivors of the period. And he's one of the few people who continue in a senior position in Egypt over the next sort of decade or so, where it all gets a little bit sticky. And the reason why it gets sticky is because of the Assyrians. Whatever had happened under Shabaka to lessen their interest in Egypt, in 674, we have an attempted invasion. And in 670, another invasion whereby Taharqa is forced to flee, nursing, according to the Assyrians, 5 arrow wounds. And also, not only that, his family have also been captured by the Assyrians. And at which point the various local rulers say they're all still in place. Pretty well all of the ones which we see, all of the various polities we saw under PA are still in existence, all then quickly change their allegiance over to the Assyrians. However, the following year, the Assyrian armies having withdrawn, Taharqa comes back and is helped by the death of the contemporary Assyrian king. And so it's a couple of years before his successor, Ashurbanipal, tries to do things back. What's notable is the fact that all these local rulers keep flip-flopping between who they're loyal to. I think that's clearly the underlying issue with the Nubia, with PA's settlement, is he doesn't try and take over as sole pharaoh. He leaves these locals, and so when it comes to the crunch here, that they will simply go with the Assyrians. I think there is a deep-seated antipathy to the idea of being ruled by Nubians amongst these Egyptian local rulers. The Nubians, vile Kush, had been some part of the Egyptian lexicon going back to the earliest times. So the idea that they should be, so therefore it's, when the Assyrians turn up, they say, wow, let's sort of go with them. But it's quite clear that in 666 BC, that they realized the Assyrians aren't actually as nice as the Nubians. And they flip back again, at which point the Assyrians get very fed up and kill a lot of them, with the exception of one person who had remained loyal to them. And guess where he comes from? Sais. So Sais is probably the one place which is consistent in all of this. And then, in the midst of all that, then Taharqa dies. He has the most impressive of all the Nubian royal tombs. In fact, the huge pyramid he designs won't fit at El Kuru, the traditional cemetery, and is built across the river in a new location of Nuri. Its interior is far more elaborate than any earlier Kushite tomb. as you can see here, and he had over 1,000 Shabti figures, one of the largest numbers of Shabtis in any tomb in Nubia or Egypt. He's followed on the Nubian throne by his nephew, Tanut Amun, and according to the stealer, so-called dream stealer, he has a dream and he decides to go and try and take Egypt back again. One more push. And initially he's successful. Nekau I is executed, and Psamtik I, his son and successor, flees to Assyria. But this Assyrian's not going to put up with this. They come back. The next year, Tanut Amun flees back into the south, and Assyrian vassals are put back in control. But it's fairly clear that very much the first among equals amongst them is Psamtik I, and over the next few years, he introduces a policy of getting rid of the other mini pharaohs and so on, and starts trying to reunify the state. And that's completed in 655 BC, when he is able to take Thebes, because Thebes remains loyal to Tanut Amun even long after everything else which has happened. In 655, Egypt can be seen as a fully united country, probably for the first time since the 11th century or even 12th century. But there is only one king, and there seems to be nobody doubting that fact, which is quite an achievement. This is just this little snapshot. What's interesting again in all of these transitions of power in Thebes is that the god's wife remains in place. When Kashta took over, the god's wife, who was a sister of Takelot III, was left in place. And now with Psamtik in charge, Shepenwepet, a daughter of Pa, who is the current god's wife, is left in place. So there's a certain degree, as far as the changes of control in Thebes, are to some degree at least negotiated. And just to finish off, Tanut Amun ultimately is buried again at El Kuru. We don't know exactly how long his reign was after he left Egypt. In fact, once we get beyond this, the reign lengths of all the Nubian pharaohs are very much up for grabs. But here we've got the burial chamber of the pyramid of Tanut Amun at El Kuru, and this is how Shabaka probably looked as well, with various elements which are really taken from the underworld books going back to the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom. And then the kingdom of Kush then carries on in the south right the way through to 350 AD. Continues to build pyramids, Egyptian-style temples. And in fact, it's been estimated there are more pyramids, at least more royal pyramids in Sudan than there are actually in Egypt. So this 350 AD is where all that comes to an end. And so when you look at the overall continuum of the Kushite kingdom, the time when it ruled Egypt was a very, very short period, but clearly of significant influence as to what happens subsequently. And so that was very much an abbreviated overview, abbreviated even further owing to the fire alarm. But if you would like to read a bit more about it, this is the book which the Treasurer mentioned, available from Amazon and all other online retailers. So thank you for your attention.
Well, I'm sure there are plenty of questions. Could I open floor to questions? Yes, please.
Yes, sir.
Or we just wait for the microphone. If you want, please. So.
Let's start chronologically. Earlier on, very early on, you mentioned the importance of gold as a source of wealth from Nubia. Do we know much about how they extracted it, how they refined it, or how they purified it?
Not directly, no. The number of gold mines have been identified, but they've been worked out, and they continue to be worked into sort of into medieval times. So we've got no, apart from understanding just simply how ancient people generally dealt with gold, we've got no first-hand material at all.
Thank you. You described North and South Nubia divided approximately by the current political line, and you talked about being ruling from the south. Where were the locations in what is today, if you like, considered Nubia, in which they were actually ruling?
Hang on, let me go back to the map. Sorry.
And they've got their
hang on, there we are.
rooms at,
Yeah, basically the heartland of the Nubian regime, the Kushite regime, is down here.
like Jebel Barka.
Jebel Barka, which is the holy mountain, Nuri, El Kuru, and Sanam. Little group there on at the end of the Dongola Reach. And that was also the heart of the Egyptian imperial regime during the New Kingdom. Most of the material from there is all sort of that. So how far that area is actually a creation of the Egyptians, which is then picked up in the post-imperial epoch, is an interesting question, because earlier on we have other sites further north, which had been the sort of.
But the tombs are mainly at Kawa that you're describing.
The temples at Kawa, yeah.
Ah.
But again, the earliest stuff at El Kuru is where the tombs are, which is that one there.
Oh, right, sorry. Okay.
There's too many K's here. And again, Kawa, everything there is sort of mainly New Kingdom and later. So a lot of the creation of that sort of part of the state comes from there. There's another site further north at Kerma, which had been the sort of traditional centre from earlier periods. So, but that's for the period we're talking about, that's the heartland, and that's where a lot of these monuments are. And then is still later, they move further south to Merowe, which is where some of the last pyramids are built. So, but it's effectively, it's Upper Nubia is the heartland anyway.
A bit of comparative chronology, please. There's a recent article in Current Archaeology about the extent of the Roman Empire. So how far into Nubia did it extend?
There's basically ping pong being played in Lower Nubia really throughout sort of both the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. But there's sort of an equilibrium is reached sort of halfway down Lower Nubia. Actually, yes, they found the head of Augustus at Merowe, which seems to have been booty from a Kushite raid, probably on Aswan. That's what it's only been interpreted as. And it was actually buried under the approach ramp of this temple. So there's a possibility that there may have been the symbolism that you were tramping on Augustus every time you entered the temple.
Should we regard Nubia as simply a part of a greater Egyptian civilization, which at the time you're talking about generated some rulers in the same way as various peripheral parts of the Roman Empire generated emperors, but weren't necessarily seen as separate entities, and people don't write books about Rome's African emperors or Rome's Balkan emperors?
I think they still regard, I think Nubia is regarded as a separate thing. The very fact that they've got the two urae is an interesting point. At no point did they regard it as having merged the two together. And even sort of in the Egyptian imperial times, the very fact it was a separate viceroyalty of Kush, it never quite became sort of part of the whole thing. So in spite of sort of imperialism in both directions, I suppose, over thousands of years, Nubia always remained a separate thing. The local language was something different, which may or may not be the same as the later Meroitic. But so I think Nubia always remains a distinctive thing. There's major interactions between the two, but I think you can always see Nubia as a separate thing. as against Egypt.
Is there any questions online? Does anybody have a comment? Well, thank you very much, Aidan, for your excellent lecture. I'm sure there's an opportunity to look at the book and learn more about this very interesting period. So thank you so much for coming to the Society again and sharing your research with us.
Thank you.
So I'd just like to inform everybody that our next lunchtime lecture will be on the 3rd of September at 1 o'clock here, and online, of course. And the title will be A Maze Without a Plan, Display in Sir John Soane's Museum, and it will be given by Bruce Fletcher, FSA. Thank you very much.